They need to connect all those. And you know, the thing is that if we accept that wolves are vital to the health of an ecosystem where wolves historically are, what does that mean? I mean, wolves are going to be historically where there were enough prey populations to sustain them. And on Isle Royal, the moose showed up and their populations just exploded for 30 years without any harassment from predators at all. Because they just had little animals on Isle Royal. So then those wolves crossed over that ice bridge in 1949, and I think there were several other crossings between there was genetic, every now and then another couple of wolves would cross over. There was some genetic mixing in from the mainland, and they thrived, and they got up to 5 different packs on that island. They each had their own territory, and then it was mostly the canine pyrovirus that, you know, this virus that was introduced by dogs, by human dogs onto the island, and the wolves got it. And now even if there was an ice bridge, those wolves would not be able to cross over because the edge of the river is too well developed. And not only that, but those wolves that do cross over would have to learn on their own how to hunt moose, which they did before, but it would be more difficult than if they had brought some wolves over. So it was another catastrophic, man. You know, I don't know, what else can I say? You know, it's true that when you get educated, when you become ecologically literate, and when you start, when you finally get taught out of the habit of just thinking about land management decisions in consequentialist, economistic, dollar value terms, and you start to really understand what's been going on and what's happened to our natural resources, and especially when you realize that in most cases, empirically, the choices that our ancestors faced were not anywhere near as stark as the way they've been portrayed. We didn't have to choose between hydroelectricity and salmon runs. We could have healthy salmon runs today without making without making very many sacrifices at all to the systems, to all the systems that we have in place. So, you know, it's kind of, so anyway, so you do come to understand the profound degree to which our resources have been mismanaged. And the salmon are one example, and the wolves, you know, more recently. Yeah. It just seems like, come on, you know, it's your job. You're a superintendent of a national park. Shouldn't you know all these things that we're taught, right? I mean, and then how do you defend your decision? What it is basically, from what I understand, from talking to other superintendents, from what I understand is they're very reluctant to be proactive, because then they're worried that they're going to be committed to that proactive course of action into the interminable future, and they don't want to do that. So they're much more comfortable, and this is the nature of an administrator, right, of a bureaucrat. They're much more comfortable just saying, well, we're going to let nature take its course, right, and then they don't have to worry about a new program of wolf introduction and managing that for the next 50 years. But it's a tragedy, you know, because not only are the wolves, you know, I'm telling you, within 2 or 3 years, because there are only 3 left, and 2 of them are brother and sister, and the third one is disabled, was born crippled, and he was born with a twisted spine, and he or she is totally not viable either. So anyway, and they're already getting old. You know, wolves in the wild only live about 8 or 10 years. So these guys are almost done, and then that's going to be it. And yet, when you show up on Isle Royal, you do the whole great big tour of Isle Royal, and you go to the visitor shop, what animal do you suppose is on every single t-shirt, every single coat, every single pack, everything in the visitor store?
Wolf.
And so the superintendent, you know, because of her administrative timidity, you know, has allowed this to happen. And now what, you know? It's terrible. And they should have introduced, but not only that, see, that's the oldest wolf, that's the oldest predator-prey study in the world. It's been going on since the late 1950s. Rolf Peterson is the main guy, and he's been there since the late 70s, I believe. And he's still there. And they've had ongoing, you know, field station, and they have this amazing body of data that they've accumulated in all that time. And now they're witnessing, old Rolf Peterson has spent his whole life, literally his whole life, studying. And he's still there, and he's going to watch the very end of it. He's going to wrap everything up, and he's going to pack up all his equipment, and that'll be that. And that study that'll be the end of it. And that's also very sad, because there's something very beautiful about a human, about humans taking the time, to pay attention to these other communities and how they're living, right? That's beautiful, to develop all that knowledge. Anyway, but we'll still have the knowledge, and maybe the wolves, hopefully somebody will get their head on straight and as well. They should just threaten to no longer sell wolves t-shirts. I resent that. I'm sorry, man. When they use a panda to sell fast food or something, and they use a grizzly bear to sell a beer or something, it seems to me that we have obligations to care for their homes when we want to take advantage of them, But and the salmon are icons. Speaking of icons, so. It seems as though when we take the liberty to use a panda or something in a food commercial, then we have an obligation to not just demolish its habitat. We have an obligation anyway, but those kind of things really bother me. That instrumentalization of an animal just needlessly and senselessly. So here we go with, again, Darwin, okay? And I owe a lot to Collicutt because my preliminary reading of Leopold was heavily indebted to Collicutt's reading of Leopold. He really set the tone for Leopoldian scholarship for years to come. And both Leopold and Collicutt, of course, are heavily indebted to Darwin and to his biosocial account of the origins. Now, I will note that Collicutt would firmly and strongly, and does firmly and strongly reject sociobiology. Okay? So the direction that E.O. Wilson, for example, takes with this biosocial Humean account, and that's totally fair. I don't know if Wilson has read any David Hume or Adam Smith, or he's even aware of the debate between the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers and Humean psychology and all that, and the Kantian. I don't know if E.O. Wilson is aware of all that, but it is certainly fair to say that if he was, if he did have to take a side, he would be very sympathetic toward Darwin and Hume's biosocial account of the origins of more. Obviously, he's very sympathetic to Darwin, but I mean, he would recognize Hume as his natural ally also. Okay, E.O. Wilson would. But all that said, Collicutt vehemently disagrees with Wilson and with Wilson's sociobiology. Okay, but he kind of flirts with it which may be an infirmity of our friend Collicutt. But Collicutt, so Collicutt offers us this explanation, this very Darwinian explanation of why we adopt moral norms and why we why we routinely act on why we are moral. Okay, this is the originary question, right? And Collicutt accepts Darwin's answer to the originary question. Humean moral psychology. Okay, this should be sort of remedial, because we've already kind of been through this, but now I'm just kind of explicitly identifying it for what it is, which is Humean moral psychology. Moral reasoning proceeds through emotions, through passions or sentiments. A moral judgment is empty and meaningless unless it has a motivational aspect. The motivational aspect is necessarily emotive, all right, emotional. Rational thinking alone does not motivate anyone to do anything. All it does, it has an organizational function for Hume, but it can't possibly motivate anybody. It has no, and that means it has no, it can carry no force. A rational rule alone can carry no force, no practical force. Only something that is accompanied by an emotional quality will carry the force that is needed to be described as a sense of obligation. Okay? All right? Right? A sense of obligation requires some kind of motivating element to it, and reason alone does not provide that. Okay? Only passion or sentiment can give a person a binding sense of obligation, according to David Hume. Reason is a slave of the passions. Okay? So what Hume is saying is not just that we get our moral rules and then we have to add some motivational dimension and then we're good to go. he's saying that we can't get our moral rules at all. We can't even get started without guidance from the sentiments, all right? And again, don't overthink this, okay? When he means, he literally means just feelings, right? Just the way that an action makes you feel ultimately is the test of whether you deem that action morally right or morally wrong, okay? So that means without any kind of feeling at all, which would be Kant's description, right? Kant wants to give us this dry metaphysics of morals. No feeling at all, right? And according to Hume, that can't possibly be right, because without feeling, you have no moral coordinates. There would be no coordinates on your compass at all. All right? So his argument is much deeper than just, he's not just Kant rules add feeling, right? He's saying, look, you can't have rules to begin with without going through feelings, all right? Feelings comprise the coordinates and the substantive content of moral reasoning. Moral reasoning could not proceed at all without feelings, okay? Sentiments. So, morality is determined by sentiment, ultimately, okay? Not by conformity with a rational rule, but by sentiment, okay? Sentiment defines virtue to be whatever mental action or quality gives to a spectator the pleasing sentiment of approbation, right? And vice the contrary. Okay, Adam Smith postulated the existence of a universal, universal laws of feeling. And Adam Smith used sort of the quaint term, fellow feeling, to describe. He said, and he thought these were just laws of human nature. He had a very optimistic outlook on the human being. An outlook which I share, actually. But in terms of what we're capable of, biologically, emotionally, psychologically, what we're capable of, it does seem that Adam Smith might have been onto something. Perhaps biologists and psychologists ought to look into this. But he called it fellow feeling, and he cited evidence of fellow feeling that our hearts naturally go out without any provocation at all. When we learn of the suffering, someone else's misfortune, for example. Okay? Pity or compassion, the emotion we feel for the misery of others when we either see it, right, when we encounter somebody crying, sobbing, or exhibiting sadness on the sidewalk, our hearts go out, right, just naturally, without any effort at all. And so Adam Smith thinks this is evidence of the universal law of empathetic connection between people, okay? And that universal law of empathetic connection between people is the basis of all of our moral systems, of all the moral norms that we apply to one another, right? Okay? See how all that works, and see how all that is much more, in a way, it kind of follows from this very biological understanding of the human being that Darwin has, right? That Darwin kind of got us on the road toward. But that was the great revolution, right? Darwin demolished the last remnants of the geocentric universe, right? The geocentric universe was also an anthropocentric universe, right? Because man, anthropos, was right at the center of everything, right? But bit by bit by bit, right? Copernicus demolished the geocentric model of the universe and gave us a heliocentric model, and we began to see that no, not everything revolves around us. And then Darwin comes along and teaches us that we're animals, right? And takes and demolishes the anthropocentric understanding of natural history, right? And the notion that natural history is headed toward the production, the generation of man, right? Which is, of course, heavily influenced by religion, right? Anyway, he demolished all that, right? And but in a way, Adam Smith saves us, because Adam Smith says that's all okay. I understand that he didn't write. That would have been too far ahead of his time. But Adam Smith would have been sympathetic to Darwin. Darwin comes later, right? Adam Smith's great book, and I could say great books, right, is the one that you've all heard about, is The Wealth of Nations, right, which is the one that economists always cite. Adam Smith is kind of the first modern economist, but the emergence of economics as an academic discipline was very interesting. In those days, it was indistinguishable from moral philosophy. I mean, it was distinguishable in content, but in the way that people approached it. And he's writing in the late 1700s, right? Adam Smith is somewhat younger than David Hume, and David Hume, 1711 to 1776. Adam Smith is, I think, 1724 to 18 something or other. But people read The Wealth of Nations, and you often cite The Wealth of Nations, and that's where the famous phrase, the invisible hand of the market, comes from, right? From Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. But unfortunately, not enough people who are fond of The Wealth of Nations have taken the time to read A Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is his great contribution to moral philosophy. And really, you can't understand, it's difficult to understand The Wealth of Nations without reading Theory of Moral Sentiments. And you make a bad hash out of the concept of the invisible hand of the market if you don't remember and recall that Adam Smith is, first of all, a moral philosopher, and his account of the invisible hand is only offered in the context of a lively moral community. Okay? So this idea that the invisible hand can be just this abstract thing that happens all the time, without a lively moral community and lively moral sentiments, feelings of fellow feeling, right? You need fellow feeling for the invisible hand to work. It's not going to work in a society of Trump supporters, you know? So don't get fooled, right? Economists want to separate the invisible hand of the market from the basic requirements of virtue and selflessness, you know, that are called out for us now, that Smith insists are natural to the human animal, right? The idea that the human animal is selfish would be the last thing Adam Smith would defend, right? This Donald Trump kind of interpretation of the human animal is that's not what Adam Smith was talking about at all. Adam Smith is really kind of refreshing to read, actually. He's a pleasure to read. He's easy to read, and he's just funny. He just makes you laugh when you read some of the things he says. Just that notion, fellow feeling, you know? I mean, you couldn't get away with that today, right? You'd be laughed at. But in those days, those were a more innocent time. But he was getting at something very profound, right? And in a way, it sounds almost like biophilia, what Adam Smith was getting at. He was getting at something that, you know, he was claiming was rooted. And so maybe we all need to become biophiliologists, to coin a word that was coined, you know, on top of E.O. Wilson's biophilia. We all need to become biophiliologists and study this kind of fellow feeling that we share not only with each other, but with all living things. That would be really cool if we could just develop some scientific basis for that. It might make our lives easier. Anyway, but note, there are some drawbacks to this account of the emergence of moral norms. We may be anchored to anthropocentric land. Again, we may be barred from that trap door at the back of the Leopoldian land ethic. Did everyone get to sign the attendance sheet for both Tuesday and Thursday? Today's Thursday. Anyway, this is the problem. It may be that Humean moral psychology is just in the end too anthropocentric, too rooted. Maybe if morality emerges through sentiment in the way that Hume describes, then it may be difficult to see how we could extend moral sentiments to non-human elements in the biotic community, right? So to the extent that we still care about those non-human elements, we care about them because they affect us. And there we go, back to an anthropocentric prudential ethic, which is not quite what we're looking for, right? So we might have to look elsewhere, but let's see, okay? And I cite this guy, Ernest Partridge. I often have my students read Ernest Partridge, but this time around, I'm having my students read Roberta Milstein's essay instead, which makes really a different point, a different kind of point, but it's also another criticism. It's another, Roberta Milstein has a different way of pointing out that Humean moral psychology is too wedded to an anthropocentric axiology. That's the basic criticism of Humean moral psychology, of environmental ethicists who try to use Humean moral psychology to build an environmental ethic. It may turn out that that's not possible. It may turn out, as Ernest Partridge argues, he says, Humean moral psychology is a poor stream in which to fish for a land ethic. Okay? So keep that criticism of Collicutt's neo-Humean reading of Leopold, which is simultaneously a neo-Humean construction of a radical environmental ethic. That's what Collicutt's offering us, right? He's saying this is it. This is the right radical environmental ethic for all of you to go about using now, and now you're good to go, right? You need to understand this one, and then you can go forth in the world with all the theoretical tools that you need to combine with your empirical knowledge, which of course you need a lot of that too, to go forth in the world and become excellent resource managers, right? He says that's all you need. You need an understanding of Humean moral sentiment, and perhaps that may not be correct. Humean moral psychology may be unavoidably anthropocentric. Morality presupposes personhood, according to Humean ethicists. Right? That's what Hume tells us. Morality presupposes personhood. And at minimum, for there to be a person, there has to be a sentient being. Okay? It doesn't necessarily need to be a human person. Okay? Humeans will recognize dog persons. Okay? Any animal that participates in your emotive community is also an animal that participates in your moral community. For Hume, right? That's kind of cool about the Humeans, is that they and the person who inspires them, David Hume, says stuff like that. Why is the dog a member of your moral community? Because the dog exhibits the same proto-moral sentiments that comprise the basis of your morality, right? Shame and guilt, feelings of approval and disapproval. The dog clearly exhibits them. You have to be just an ignoramus, an idiot, and deny reality. What's plain as day, that dogs exhibit moral sentiments, right? In their body language. So they are members of our moral community. And then foreshadow, all of a sudden, open the door just a little bit on the neo-Kantians, and they're in there screaming about that whole idea, right? That's ridiculous, the idea that a dog, because a dog has no rationality. So it's preposterous to suggest that he could be a member of our moral community for the neo-Kantians, right? For the old school Kantians. Obviously, we got some animalized Kantians that they're not screaming at all. In fact, they're over there trying to change their classical. Anyway, got all these things going on, right, behind the scenes that we can't pay attention to. We got to just try to stay focused. So, the challenge of relying on. So it may be that moral sentiment, if the neo-Humeans are right, then moral sentiment is an emotional and evaluative attitude toward persons or their institutions. Right? Moral, for the neo-Humeans, implies responsibility, accountability, praise, and blame. A moral judgment is a judgment which reflects upon the worth of a person. Okay? In a planet without persons, however teeming with sentient but non-deliberative and non-reflective life, there will be goods and bads, but no morality, no right and wrong, no justice, no duties, no rights. Okay? So, in other words, Humean moral psychology is not going to give us moral norms that extend any farther than sentient beings. Okay? So the idea that we have moral obligations to the climate system, the idea that we have moral obligations to the earth as a whole, the idea that we have moral obligations to salmon runs in the Snake River would be preposterous. Direct moral obligations, I mean. We might have moral obligations to protect those things for our own interests, right? Or some other or for the interests of sentient beings, right? Who are reciprocal, right? Who have enough there, enough going on. There's somebody there, right? There's somebody home, right? All right? So that may be the outer limits of Humean moral psychology, which means those are the outer limits of moral norms. That's as far as moral norms can go in a Humean moral universe. You guys see that? Okay? So the trapdoor to recognizing moral status in non-human entities, sorry, it's all locked up, or it's not there. Bummer, huh? Maybe that's a big problem, and wouldn't that be devastating if you're Baird Collicutt and you made your whole career out of this interpretation of Leopold and this is the way to go with the land ethic? It's kind of devastating. And you might be busy writing, to defend yourself, which he is, against these sort of charges. But it helps us. And I don't know if these charges are fair or not. I don't take a position. I have a lot of respect for this guy, but he may be off going down the wrong trail in his reading of Leopold. And So, but let's see if he is or not. He may not be, okay? He may not be if there is a biological basis for feelings of pleasure and, shall we say, disgust, perhaps, over what some of the things that are done. Clear cuts, damming rivers, slaughtering dolphins. These things may not call out any direct moral obligations in us, but because of biophilia. Biophilia, again, might do more than E.O. Wilson. It might be a bigger concept and a more effective concept than even E.O. Wilson, the guy who came up with it, even imagined. And that's actually something that Partridge points out. Those of you who are interested, go read Partridge's essay. It's not that long. It's a little bit dense. But the kind of criticism of Collicott that I'm outlining for you is outlined more clearly and more carefully in that essay by Ernest Partridge, which I believe I've cited for you somewhere. He has a couple different websites, and one of his websites, you can type his name into your search engine, and one of his websites has all of his philosophical publications. Very interesting gentleman. Classical guitarist, among other things. I mean, professional. And he taught. He never had a tenure-track job. He's published quite a bit, though, in environmental philosophy, environmental ethics. But yeah, you can go to his website and find all his publications there. And this is his criticism that I've kind of borrowed, which I've laid out for you in more simple terms. So moral sentiments, maybe for neo-Humeans, can only involve emotions applied toward persons. Because that's the context, that's the only context in which they could emerge, right? Persons who are deliberative, who can do those simple things like I was talking about earlier. Trade off your rights, right? Contemplate robbing the convenience store and then going and doing it knowing that you're trading off, you're giving up your rights to liberty. No other animal can do those kinds of things. And so perhaps the term moral agent, right, can only apply to other humans, and then all of our moral sentiments only develop and can apply to other humans. But perhaps there is a way to get at what Collicott is trying to get at. And that is through this concept of biophilia. But then, according to, and Partridge says that's fine, but it's not really a moral sentiment anymore then. If you want to call yourself a Humean, then you have to accept Humean's account of moral sentiments. And they don't extend. So you might have sentiments toward forests and toward elephants, right? And toward salmon runs, elephant populations, right? Elephants, that's easy, right? That's easy. But populations of salmon runs, etc., genetic poles. You might have sentiments toward those, but they're non-moral sentiments, right? And biophilia would be an example of a non-moral sentiment. Okay? But anyway, the idea that a lot of Humean scholars would come back at Collicott, who's made a lot of use of Hume, but probably can't be called a Humean scholar, I don't think. I mean, he certainly knows his Hume, but I'm not sure if he would be accepted as a scholar of Hume. And a lot of scholars of Hume would respond to Collicott by saying that, wait a minute now, for David Hume, moral sentiments have their origin in interpersonal relationships. And these are evoked by our recognition of the personhood or sentience of the other. David Hume himself said that inanimate objects can never be the object of love or hatred, nor are they consequently susceptible of merit or iniquity. Okay? So, the Humean moralist will favor the logger and his dependent family over the old-growth forest. The Humean moral theorist, moral philosopher, will even favor the Taiji fisherman over the Taiji dolphins. Okay? Perhaps that'd be harder because it's easier to see the dolphins as persons. They call them fishermen and they call them fish. Now, I suspect that's part of their almost subconscious, way of rationalizing what they do. It's quite shocking. I can't observe. I don't watch that movie. I don't want to watch it, but it is very shocking. It seems to me that this question of whether or not has confidence that humans are going to treat him well or not is important. If an animal is cognitively sophisticated enough to believe that humans are going to treat him well, then humans mistreating that animal is much worse, maybe. And so if those dolphins are going into that cove, some of them, a lot of them I think are just forced in there, but some of them might be going in there because they think that they're going to get to interact with somebody that they admire, these humans that they admire. And if that's the case, then the moral wrong seems greater, and that would be accounted for, right, by David Hume. Because if that's the case, then they're sharing some fellow feelings with us, right? And that makes that carries with it some moral obligations automatically, right? Because those fellow feelings carry feelings of approval and disapproval, which are proto-moral feelings, all right? Which carry obligations. So, fascinating, isn't it? All right. But if they can just be called fish, right, then they don't have that depth of interior that a dolphin has, that a mammal has. Right? And so if you live that way, then you're going to want to call them fish. You're going to want to call yourself a fisherman. But in any event, our hearts don't reach out in the same manner to inanimate objects. With the dolphins, it's easier. We are not equipped, for example, to feel kinship, though, with a stream, right, or a climate system, or a salmon run, a genetic lineage. Those are all abstractions. And it's impossible to, on a Darwinian account, to evolve, right, to evolve systems of kinship with streams, right? It may turn out that treating the stream well is important to our kinships, right? But isn't an object of kinship in itself. Yes?
The quote there that says that inanimate objects can never be the object of love or hatred, is Hume referring to that, like, the inanimate objects cannot love or hate each other, or that humans cannot love or hate inanimate objects? Because
humans cannot love or hate inanimate objects, that's right.
Seems
and so they can't, it seems demonstrably false.
Yeah, people love cars.
They love what cars do for them.
Yeah.
But what's his definition of love or hate, I guess?
Well, this is probably from his treatise on human nature. That's a really big book, but take a class on Hume. I don't know. That's a really good, challenging point, though. Andrew. Inanimate objects can never be. But I think I think the point is that to be a legitimate object for your anger to be directed accurately and properly, it has to be directed at an entity that has made a decision, that has exercised a will of some kind. Could be a dog, could be a deer, could be some wild animal perhaps. That is much more rare. But in the